The sky above the Cedar Peak wilderness had never looked more alive than it did that morning, streaked with hues of violet and peach as the sun began its slow climb over the ridge. The air was crisp, fresh, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth, as if the forest had just woken up. The winding trail beneath Eliza McCall's boots was still moist with dew, the ground soft and forgiving, as she hiked alone, as she often did. A lover of solitude, she found comfort in the rhythms of nature, in the steady crunch of gravel underfoot, the occasional call of a distant bird, the faint rustle of leaves overhead. It was in these moments, surrounded by the wilderness she adored, that she felt truly at peace. Her backpack was light, a few essentials, water, a snack, a map she barely needed. She'd been hiking these same trails for years, ever since she'd moved to the area with her partner, Mark. They had both shared a love for the outdoors, but it was Eliza who felt most at home when she was out here, away from the clutter and noise of city life. She had always believed that nature held the answers to things she couldn't explain, that somehow, in the deep quiet of the forest, she could escape the weight of the world. Mark had offered to join her that day, but she had insisted on going alone. She loved the feeling of independence, of carving out her own path. They had talked the night before, simple things. Mark was concerned about her hiking so far alone, as the wilderness had its risks. He knew her stubbornness, though, and relented, knowing she'd be back by afternoon. He would wait for her at the cabin, cooking dinner, planning their next adventure together. But as the hours slipped by and the sun climbed higher, there was no sign of Eliza returning. Mark's calls went unanswered. The radio on the dashboard of the cabin remained silent, the humming of the engine outside the only sound that filled the space. By the time dusk fell, Mark's worry turned to dread. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, a sense of panic creeping into his chest. He wasn't accustomed to this feeling. Eliza was never late. He couldn't imagine what had gone wrong. Had she fallen? Was she hurt? His mind raced through every possible scenario. As he neared the trailhead where Eliza's car was parked, his heart skipped a beat. Her car was still there, as it had been for the past few hours, parked in the same place, untouched. He scanned the area, the small clearing where the trail began, but there was no sign of her. Not even the familiar prints in the dirt where she would have stood to lace her boots before heading up the path. His breath caught in his throat. Where could she be? Mark's pulse quickened as he approached the trail. He had no choice but to follow. The trail twisted into the forest, a narrow pathway lined with boulders and tall ferns. The air was thick now, the sunlight dimming beneath the canopy of ancient trees. There was something unsettling about the quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirps of birds and rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, seemed absent. The trees, though magnificent, felt oppressive now, as if they were closing in around him. He pressed forward, his eyes darting from side to side. It wasn't long before Mark came across Eliza's backpack, her water bottle still attached to the side, the strap lying loosely on the ground. Her jacket was nearby, discarded hastily as if she had been in a hurry. But there was no sign of Eliza herself. A sense of dread settled in his chest as he crouched beside the items. Her phone, the one she'd left in her pack, was still inside, its screen cracked. He turned it on. No recent calls, no messages. Mark's throat tightened. What had happened to her? She wouldn't leave her things behind like this. Not unless something had happened, something that had forced her to abandon her possessions. His thoughts raced. She couldn't have just vanished. The silence around him deepened, suffocating him as the weight of the situation hit him. Mark's eyes scanned the surrounding woods, but there were no signs, no broken branches, no sign of struggle. It was as if Eliza had simply walked into the forest and disappeared, as if the trees had swallowed her whole. A sick feeling settled in his stomach as he turned around, heading back to the trailhead. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He rushed back to the car, his legs aching from the strain, the panic beginning to take hold. As he reached the clearing, he could see a few other cars parked near the trailhead, the faint shadows of figures moving in the distance. Word must have gotten out. He wasn't the only one looking for her now. The park ranger, a woman in her 40s named Grace, approached Mark with a grim look. She was no stranger to disappearances. Her job involved them too often, too regularly. She had seen the fear in people's eyes before. "We're going to need to call and search and rescue," Grace said. Her voice was steady, but Mark could hear the concern beneath the surface. "If she's still out there, we'll find her." He nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. "How long does it usually take?" His voice cracked as he spoke. He had to know. He had to believe. "We'll search through the night," Grace answered. "We have dogs on the way, and we've alerted the helicopters. It's a big area, though, so it might take time." Time. Time was the one thing Mark couldn't afford. He swallowed hard, staring into the vastness of the wilderness. The forest, once a place of tranquility, now seemed like an endless labyrinth, a place that could conceal secrets, and perhaps something far darker. The search began that night, with volunteers lighting up the trail and rangers canvassing the forest, calling out her name. But Eliza McCall was nowhere to be found. As the hours turned into days, Mark stayed at the trailhead, pacing, clinging to hope. Her face, her laugh, her spirit seemed so close, just within reach. But still, she was out there somewhere, hidden beneath the thick trees, the mountains, the very earth she had loved. The search parties grew larger, involving local police, national park rangers, and volunteers from surrounding towns. Helicopters buzzed above, sweeping across the treetops, but all they found were fleeting glimpses of the landscape, and nothing of Eliza. As the days passed, the weight of the situation began to settle in. The police, though dedicated, seemed to be losing hope, as if the vastness of the terrain was too much, too many places to search. And with each passing day, the frustration grew. With each empty search, the feeling that Eliza might never come back, that she was lost to the wilderness, settled deeper in their hearts. The sky was dull on the third morning of the search, a gray expanse that hung heavy above the Cedar Peak wilderness, mirroring the sinking hope in Mark's chest. The first light of day barely broke through the dense canopy of pines, casting long, narrow shadows across the ground. The forest seemed colder now, its beauty no longer a sanctuary but a sprawling labyrinth, its vastness a threatening unknown. Eliza had been gone for 3 days, and still there was no trace. The search was no longer a simple affair. What had started as a few rangers and volunteers calling out her name had grown into a coordinated, large-scale operation. Teams had arrived from nearby towns, some familiar with the terrain, others experts in search and rescue. There were K-9 units, heavily outfitted, their sharp noses trained to catch even the faintest scent of Eliza's trail. Drones hummed overhead, their eyes scanning the thick forest canopy for any hint of movement. The helicopters circled the mountains, casting their shadows like ominous vultures. But the wilderness remained indifferent. Mark had joined the search that morning, though he felt more like an observer than a participant. His eyes searched the trail, the towering trees, the distant hills, anywhere that might hold a clue, any place where Eliza might have gone, but there was nothing. It felt like she had been erased, as though the forest had swallowed her whole. "Mark, you all right?" Grace, the park ranger, approached him with her face lined with exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, a few strands falling loose from the strain of the long hours. She had seen this before, too many times. She knew how these things went, how they always seemed to stretch out into infinity, the hope flickering until it was gone. "I'm fine," Mark replied, his voice hollow, not sure he was even convincing himself. He ran a hand through his hair, pushing it back, but there was no stopping the dread pooling in his stomach. "How are we doing on the search? Have we found anything?" Grace's gaze flicked to the horizon, where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the horizon. "We've been over this area for hours now. Nothing, but we're spreading out. There's still a lot of ground to cover." Mark nodded, though his heart sank further. He had seen enough of these operations to know how they ended. The search would go on for a while longer, maybe even days, but at some point, the park rangers would have to admit that they were fighting an impossible battle, that Eliza was simply gone. They pressed on, their boots crunching against the trail, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot echoing through the stillness of the forest. Every step felt heavier, like they were walking through quicksand. Mark's thoughts were a storm. Was she alive? Had something happened to her? Or had she simply walked into the forest, never to return? A few hours later, Grace's radio crackled, breaking the monotony of their trudging. She stopped abruptly and raised the device to her ear, her expression sharpening as she listened. "Hold on," she said, turning to Mark. "They've got a lead." A lead. Mark's pulse quickened as the words took hold. He could hardly believe it. A part of him didn't want to believe it after days of searching. It was so hard to imagine there would be anything substantial. But the spark of hope was a dangerous thing, and he clung to it. "They found something," Grace continued, her voice tight. "A witness. A couple of hikers reported seeing someone, a woman, matching Eliza's description, heading up the trail around noon yesterday. They're bringing them in for a statement now." Mark's stomach tightened. "Do they know anything more?" "No, just that she was headed in this direction," Grace said, her tone steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. "But it's something. We can work with this." The group turned back toward the main search area, Mark's heart beating in his ears, the ground seeming to move beneath him. He fought to keep his thoughts in check, but they ran wild, a frenzy of what-ifs. What if the witness hadn't seen Eliza? What if it was just a coincidence? But it was the first tangible lead they had gotten, and he couldn't afford to let it slip by. As they returned to the base camp, the tension in the air thickened. Volunteers milled about, pacing, checking their gear, trying to distract themselves from the gnawing uncertainty. The buzzing of drones overhead became a constant hum in the background, while the helicopters circled again, like vultures waiting for the moment when the wilderness would give up its secret. A group of rangers huddled in a corner, heads close together, speaking in low voices. They looked up as Mark and Grace approached. "They've spoken to the hikers," one of the rangers, a man in his 30s named Greg, said as he turned toward them. "They're sure it was her. They said they saw her stop near the creek, just south of here, maybe around noon." Mark's heart skipped a beat. That was near a difficult part of the trail, an area that had a steep drop-off and dense underbrush. It was the kind of place hikers rarely ventured unless they knew it well. The idea that Eliza might have been there alive, still somewhere in the wilderness, made his throat tighten. Greg continued. "They said she seemed odd, a little disoriented, maybe. They weren't sure if she was hurt or just tired. They didn't approach her, but they said she was heading off toward the ridge." The ridge. Mark felt a coldness wash over him as the word hit his mind. That part of the trail was dangerous, even for the most experienced hikers. It was easy to lose your bearings there, with the terrain shifting from open trails to narrow, jagged paths, and the risk of falling was high. "We need to send a team out there," Grace said, her voice firm. "Get a few volunteers. Get more eyes on that area. It's a dangerous spot, but if she's still out there, we can't let her go." "Not again." Mark nodded, his own thoughts racing. Could she still be alive? Was she hiding, waiting for help? Or had something else happened? Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, and yet there was still a tiny thread of hope holding him together. Maybe, just maybe, they would find her. The team set off toward the ridge, the wind picking up as they climbed higher into the mountains. Mark trailed behind, his thoughts fixated on Eliza, the forest, and the helplessness that seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud. The landscape stretched out ahead, vast and untamed, both beautiful and deadly in its quiet way. For a moment, he thought he heard something, soft, like a whisper in the wind, but when he looked around, there was nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza was out there, somewhere, just waiting to be found. He refused to believe she was gone, not yet. There had to be something. There had to be a way. But with each step, the distance between them seemed to grow. Time had begun to wear down the edges of hope. It was now 2 months since Eliza McCall had vanished into the Cedar Peak wilderness, and with each passing day, the search had become more a matter of routine than urgency. The bright, desperate energy of the early days had faded, replaced by the grim, unyielding reality that no one knew where she was, or what had happened to her. The wilderness, so vast and indifferent, had swallowed her up, and despite all the resources, all the manpower, all the prayers and pleas, it hadn't given her back. The search was officially called off, a decision that left Mark in a state of numb disbelief. He had hoped for so much more, had thought that something, anything, would turn up. Instead, All that remained were the empty spaces where Eliza used to be. The trail where they had walked, the cabin they had shared, the meals they would have eaten together. The silence in their home was deafening. He hadn't even touched her things, her clothes still hanging in the closet, the sound of her laughter still echoing in the empty rooms. Grace, the park ranger, had been one of the first to suggest that they scale back the search. She was pragmatic, a seasoned professional, and she knew that there was only so much that could be done. The forest was unrelenting, and the chances of finding anything now were slim. "We've done everything we can," she told him, her voice steady but worn, like someone who had seen this all too often. "The dogs have been over the trail. The helicopters haven't picked up any sign. It's time to call it." Mark had nodded, but inside, the words felt like a death sentence. How could they stop? How could he? Despite the official suspension of the search, Mark wasn't ready to let go. The silence gnawed at him, and he continued to drive out to the park, walking the trails on his own, hoping for some miraculous turn of events. It was a fool's hope, but it was all he had left. He couldn't accept that Eliza, the woman he had loved so fiercely, had simply vanished into nothingness. The townspeople, too, felt the weight of the case settling into the dust. Some, like Grace, had moved on to the next case, the next missing person, the next crisis that needed attention. But others, particularly Eliza's friends and family, kept her memory alive. Mark started a Facebook page, hoping to rally the community once more, to stir up some kind of renewed search. The posts were filled with hashtags, with pleas for information, with photos of Eliza laughing under the sun, hiking the very trails they had both loved. It was a daily ritual now. Every post, every comment felt like a small rebellion against the crushing silence. But the months went by, and nothing came. Not a single tip, not a shred of new evidence. The case went cold. Then, almost exactly a year after Eliza disappeared, the town's attention was briefly reignited by an event that seemed, at first, unrelated. A young woman had gone missing on a hiking trail, not far from where Eliza's car had been found. The case had no immediate connection to Eliza, no direct link, but the incident reopened old wounds for everyone involved. For a few weeks, the community rallied once again. Posters went up. Search teams scoured the area. But it, too, ended in failure. The woman was never found. The local news, hungry for something to hold on to, jumped on the connection. They reported on the second disappearance with a flourish, hinting at the possibility of a serial abductor, a predator hiding in plain sight. The idea of a connection between the two cases, though never officially confirmed, was whispered about in the local diner and in town meetings. Some even began to speculate that the two women's disappearances were related, that perhaps Eliza wasn't the only victim of a ruthless predator lurking in the woods. But as quickly as it had started, the buzz died down. The second case went cold, just like Eliza's. Mark, ever the optimist, refused to accept that this was the end. He spent hours online, combing through forums and message boards, piecing together every scrap of information he could find. Some nights, he couldn't sleep, pacing back and forth in their cabin, his mind racing through the details. He even hired a private investigator, a man named Jonah Fields, who had a reputation for solving difficult cases. Jonah didn't bring any new revelations, though. He combed through the details, interviewed witnesses who had long since moved on with their lives, but came up empty-handed. The case remained a dead end. Then, one crisp fall morning, a new development appeared, one that would bring Eliza's case back into the light, though not in the way Mark had hoped. A local researcher, Dr. Emily Prescott, was walking her dog in the same part of the forest where Eliza had been hiking when she found something. It wasn't much, just a piece of clothing, buried beneath a pile of fallen leaves. But it was enough to stop her in her tracks. At first, she thought it was just another piece of litter, trash left behind by careless hikers. But when she knelt down to inspect it, her blood ran cold. It was a bright blue hiking jacket, the kind Eliza had worn in all the photos. Dr. Prescott immediately contacted the authorities, and within hours, a team of forensic specialists arrived at the scene. As they combed the area for more evidence, they uncovered more items: Eliza's backpack, a set of car keys, a torn photograph of Mark and Eliza on their last trip together. But there was still no sign of Eliza. No body, No footprints leading away from the scene. Just the haunting remains of what had been. The clothing was sent off for forensic testing, but it would take time for the results to come back. It was a breakthrough, yes, but a small one. It was the first real evidence anyone had found in over a year. It was something, but just how much did it really reveal? As Mark stood at the edge of the woods, his gaze fixed on the spot where the items had been found, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Finally, after all this time, the case might be moving forward. The forest was beginning to give up its secrets. But as the wind rustled through the trees, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was much darker than anyone could imagine. What had happened to Eliza? And who had left those items there, so carefully placed, so deliberately abandoned? The answers were still out there, hidden somewhere in the woods, where the trees whispered their secrets and the ground swallowed up the past. The months following the discovery of Eliza's belongings were a blur of investigation, renewed hope, and a creeping sense of dread. Despite the glimmer of progress, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial. The discovery had been monumental. Dr. Emily Prescott's find had brought everything back to the forefront, but there was still a sense of ambiguity. The forest held its secrets tightly, and the pieces of the puzzle seemed just out of reach. The items found by Dr. Prescott were painstakingly analyzed in a forensic lab, and though the results were inconclusive on many fronts, there was one breakthrough that could not be ignored: DNA. The fabric of Eliza's jacket and backpack held traces of blood, enough to indicate that something violent had occurred. The lab technician had been careful in her notes. Trace amounts of blood suggest a potential struggle, but not a fatal injury. The analysis wasn't definitive enough to confirm the worst, but it was enough to suggest that Eliza had been in a life-threatening situation. There was also something else, something that turned the case in an entirely new direction. The clothing, the backpack, the photograph. It wasn't just that these items had been discarded carelessly. They were left in a specific spot, a spot Mark knew too well. It was close to a remote clearing in the forest, a place not easily accessible, a place only a few locals knew. Mark stood by the edge of the clearing now, feeling the weight of the years pressing on his chest. His eyes scanned the area, but it all seemed so much different now, empty, haunted by memories of what had been. His mind was no longer focused on Eliza's disappearance alone. Something else was pulling at him, something darker, a realization that had begun to take root after all these months. He turned to Grace, who had accompanied him on the walk through the woods that day. The tension between them was palpable. There was a shared understanding, a wordless acknowledgement of what this new lead might mean. Who else knew about this place? Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though the forest might answer for him. Who else knew where Eliza's things were found? Grace paused, her eyes narrowing as she took in the surroundings. Her brow furrowed, as if weighing his question carefully. Not many people. It's an isolated spot, easy to miss unless you know where to look. I've only ever taken a few people there myself, other rangers, sometimes, when we've had to scout new areas. Not tourists. It's too far off the main trail. Mark's pulse quickened. There was something unsettling in the way she said it, something that hinted at a deeper connection to the spot than mere familiarity. Could someone have been watching her? Waiting for her to come by, he asked, almost to himself. Grace didn't respond right away, but when she did, her voice was strained. It's possible, but it's also possible she stumbled upon someone or something that led her into that spot. We've been looking at the wrong angle for too long. Maybe she didn't go missing in the way we thought. Mark's heart skipped. The thought settled uneasily in his mind. Had Eliza known her abductor? Had she been lured to that spot, tricked into thinking she was safe? It didn't fit the narrative they'd all built. It didn't fit the image of Eliza, a woman who knew this forest better than anyone, a woman who loved the wilderness, not some naive hiker. But the more Mark thought about it, the more that possibility took root. Eliza had been smart. She had been cautious. If she had been ambushed, if she had been taken by surprise, it meant that someone had been there, waiting for her. A few days later, forensic teams returned to the clearing where the items had been found. They were thorough, examining every inch of the surrounding area. Mark followed them closely, his mind racing with possibilities. but each step forward only seemed to deepen the mystery. The ground was undisturbed in most places, save for a few loose patches of earth, the occasional branch broken in odd angles, as though something heavy had passed through the area. Then, as one of the rangers moved deeper into the woods, they stumbled upon something that would change everything. "Mark! Grace! Over here!" the ranger shouted. Mark's heart raced as he hurried toward the sound. What now? What had they found this time? It didn't take long to see what had drawn their attention. A pile of leaves and debris had been pushed aside, revealing something that immediately sent a cold shiver down Mark's spine. Beneath the pile, half hidden from view, was a metal object, shiny and sleek, with traces of dirt and grime on it. It looked out of place, too clean, too deliberate. It was a camera, a small, handheld camera, the kind that would be used to document moments, to capture details. But who had left it here? Who would leave such a thing in the middle of nowhere? Mark crouched down, feeling his breath catch in his throat. His mind began to race. Could this be the key to finding Eliza? Could this be a sign, a clue that the person who had taken her had been watching her, documenting her every move? Grace kneeled beside him, her face taut with apprehension. "I've never seen anything like this before," she murmured. "Who would leave a camera in the middle of the woods?" The camera was carefully retrieved, and forensic specialists took it in for analysis. It wasn't long before they confirmed that it held footage that seemed to be part of a much larger story. There were recordings of the forest, yes, but also of people. Faces blurry in the shadows. Footage of hikers, even of Mark and Eliza, taken without their knowledge. The videos were fragmented, short bursts of activity, but they painted a chilling picture. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been following them, and that someone was close. Days turned into a blur as authorities sifted through the footage, piecing together the puzzle. Mark watched as the faces on the screen flickered, ghostly and distant, until they finally managed to focus on one figure, a man who was unfamiliar to him. He was older, unremarkable in appearance, a man whose face seemed to blend in with the shadows. He moved through the forest with ease, his camera capturing everything in his path, watching from a distance. There was something eerie about the footage, the way the camera seemed to follow Eliza so closely, the way it lingered on her, capturing her every movement. The police identified the man as a local, someone who had worked for years in the area as a park maintenance worker, a man named Calvin Holt. He was quiet, kept to himself, and had no criminal record to speak of. He was, in many ways, the last person anyone would suspect. But as the investigation progressed, the chilling truth began to emerge. Holt had been living in the shadows of the town for years, unnoticed, seemingly harmless. His job had kept him on the outskirts of society, hidden among the trees and the trails, watching, waiting. And now, he had been watching Eliza. The discovery of Calvin Holt's footage hit like a thunderclap. It didn't matter how quietly the park maintenance worker had lived, or how little suspicion he had raised in the past. Now he was at the center of the investigation, and his secrets were beginning to unfurl in the harsh light of scrutiny. Mark had been through hell in the last year, clinging to the hope that Eliza was still out there, somewhere. But as the authorities began to piece together the timeline of the footage, something in him broke. The realization that someone had been stalking her, had been so close to her, and yet never made himself known. It was too much to bear. It wasn't just a tragic disappearance anymore. It was something far more sinister. Someone had been hiding in the shadows, watching his partner, and he had done nothing to protect her. The surveillance team was quick to set up a full investigation into Calvin Holt's life. They traced his movements, his job history, any acquaintances he might have had in the town. On paper, Holt appeared as innocuous as they come, unassuming, reserved, a quiet man who lived in a modest trailer on the outskirts of Cedar Peak. He'd worked for the Park Service for over a decade, maintaining trails and grounds, always just enough on the periphery of the community to avoid suspicion. His co-workers didn't speak ill of him, but none seemed particularly close to him either. The isolation of the job suited Holt, and he took pride in it. No one thought twice when he'd disappear into the woods for days at a time. After all, it wasn't unusual for someone in his line of work to spend time away from the main camp, maintaining remote areas of the park. And he had never shown signs of violence. He was just a man who kept to himself. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover a different story. Holt had been living in the woods, in more ways than one. His trailer, seemingly ordinary at first glance, contained a web of disturbing items. Maps of the park, some marked with red excess, others with dates that matched Eliza's hiking trips. There were photos, old Polaroids, most of them blurry, but all of them showing women hiking alone on various trails, none of them recognizable at first. But as forensic teams went through the images, one stood out. It was a photo of Eliza, taken from a distance, her back to the camera, as she hiked the very trail where she had gone missing. The photos had been taken months before her disappearance. Mark stood in the sterile, clinical environment of the sheriff's office, staring at the evidence. The Polaroid was laid out on the desk before him, the image of Eliza captured so innocently, so unaware of the danger lurking behind her. It made his stomach turn. He wanted to scream, to rage, to tear through the evidence and demand answers from the photos themselves. But there was nothing he could do. The truth was already in front of him, and it was worse than he could have imagined. "His pattern is starting to make sense," Grace said, her voice steady as she placed a second photo down next to the first. It was another image of Eliza, but this time it was closer. She was resting by the trail, her water bottle in hand, looking out at the distant mountains. The angle was odd, too deliberate, too precise. Was he stalking her? Mark asked, his voice barely audible. "We think so. The footage we found was just the beginning," Grace continued. "We've reviewed all his movements over the past year. He's been tracking her, watching her from the shadows. He had this obsession, and it's clear now. He was following her every step." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the full weight of it hit him. Holt had been in the woods, right there, while Eliza had hiked. She had been so close to him, close enough that she could have sensed something was wrong. He fought back tears as he thought of the last few hours they'd spent together, of the quiet conversation they'd shared before she set off on her hike. Had she known? Had she felt the danger in the air? "Where is he now?" Mark asked, his voice suddenly more urgent. "He's at home," Grace replied. "We have a team monitoring his movements, but we haven't made a move yet. We want to be sure before we confront him." But as Grace spoke, Mark couldn't sit still. He couldn't wait any longer. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, of rage, of pain, of every moment he had spent wondering where Eliza was, of every sleepless night he had spent in the cabin. His heart was screaming for justice, for closure, for the truth. "I'm going after him," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. Grace stepped forward, her hand on his arm. "Mark, wait. We need to be smart about this. If he's the one who took her, then we need to catch him in the act. We can't risk him going underground again." But Mark couldn't stand still. He had to move, to confront this man who had destroyed everything he held dear. He didn't care about the risks. He didn't care about playing it safe anymore. "Get the team together," Mark said, his eyes burning with determination. "We're going now." The confrontation with Holt was inevitable, and as Mark, Grace, and a team of rangers moved out toward the trailer where Holt was hiding, the tension in the air thickened. Mark's mind replayed the images, Holt's face, the Polaroids, the footage. He had been living in the periphery of their lives, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. And now, they were about to take that moment away from him. The trailer was quiet when they arrived, nestled on the edge of the forest, surrounded by trees that had witnessed too many secrets. There was a palpable sense of danger in the air, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. The team approached the trailer cautiously, weapons drawn but eyes sharp, ready for whatever lay ahead. Holt was inside, and Mark could feel the tension crackling between him and the rangers. When the door was finally kicked in, the man they found inside wasn't the monster Mark had imagined. Holt wasn't some wild-eyed killer, raving with madness. He was sitting at a table, his hands folded in front of him, staring down at the surface, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. He didn't flinch when they entered. He didn't try to run. "Mr. Holt," Grace said, her voice cold, her gun trained on him. "We need to talk." Holt looked up slowly, his eyes unnervingly calm, as if he had already accepted his fate. I knew this was coming, he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. I wasn't hiding. I've been here the whole time. The words sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Grace's voice cut through the stillness. You've been stalking Eliza McCall. You took her, didn't you? Holt didn't answer right away. He looked at Mark, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary, before speaking softly. Not in the way you think, Holt replied. She was never supposed to get hurt. I never meant for any of this to happen. And with those words, the chilling truth began to unravel.